Okay, so here we are again, due to unforeseen circumstances, with our next lecture. And this is specifically moving into the American Revolution, which takes place in the late 1700s. So if you have not already, please make sure that you have the PowerPoint US 3 from the portal. And here we go. So the ideological movement known as the American Enlightenment was a critical precursor to the American Revolution. Chief among the ideas of the American Enlightenment were the concepts of liberalism, republicanism, as well as fear of corruption. Collectively, the acceptance of these concepts by a growing number of American colonists began to foster an intellectual environment which would lead to a new sense of political and social identity. So within the Enlightenment, that which comes from England and over into America, reason is key. Thinking through, logic, it's very, very important. John Locke, who lived in the 1600s, dying in 1704, his ideas on liberty greatly influenced the political thinking behind the Revolution, especially through his indirect influence on English writers. He's often referred to as the philosopher of the American Revolution, and he is credited with leading Americans to the critical concepts of social contract, natural rights, and being born free and equal. Locke, in turn, was influenced by Protestant theology as well. He argued that since all humans were created free and equal, that governments needed the consent of the governed. So this goes back to that idea of a social contract. There is a contract between the people and their government is bound to protect the people and to listen to the people. Both Lockean concepts were central to the United States Declaration of Independence, which deduced human equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from the biblical belief in creation. So the main points of John Locke's theories are, one, there should be limited sovereignty. The government should not have full and total control. They are limited in what they can do. That people have a right to liberty and property. Remember, property is that economic freedom that the people are hoping for. Then we have Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was more so an advocate of a strong government, even though he argued as well that people, generally speaking, have a right to life. The theory, going back to this idea of a social contract, which Rousseau writes about, he has an idea of a general will of the people in which basically it would be like a true form of democracy, you know, one person, one vote, that kind of thing, and then majority rule. So general will of the people. But he also promotes this theory of a social contract. And the social contract theory is... it influenced the belief among many of the founders that among the natural rights of man was the right of the people to overthrow their leaders should those leaders betray what were sort of historically the basic rights of Englishmen. The founding fathers were strong advocates of Republican values, which required men to put civic duty ahead of their personal desires. So men had a civic duty to be prepared and willing to fight for their rights, as well as for the rights and liberties of their countrymen. For women, there's an idea of Republican motherhood, which becomes the ideal. And we see this exemplified by Abigail Adams, as well as Mercy Otis Warren. So the first duty of the Republican woman was to instill Republican values in her children and to avoid luxury and ostentation. So, don't be too showy, that kind of thing. These ideas spread rapidly. Now, in the American colonies, there's a higher literacy rate than what you'll find in many of Western civilization at this point. Americans love to read. And, we have to go back to the Protestant Reformation to really understand why. They want to read the Bible, because to read the Bible is to know how to live a good life. So because of this push towards literacy, you have lots and lots of newspapers and pamphlets. These are not brochures. These are going to be like basically teeny tiny little books that will spread these revolutionary ideas throughout the colonies. But it also spreads through the church, because the church sees breaking away and revolution. They start to preach this as being okay, because they see liberty as equivalent to sort of a religious liberty. They don't want the church to be governed by a secular hierarchy. If you remember, England in particular, their sort of state church is the Church of England, and the head of that church is the monarch. So the church is very focused on ensuring that the people have liberty. Taxes start becoming burdensome. We already mentioned in our last lecture the different acts that were taking place, the Stamp Act in particular, which really irritated the colonists. The people saw everything that they needed as basic rights, such as protection. Let's look at this. With westward expansion being all but denied to colonists, colonists legally could not move beyond a certain point. If you remember, after the French and Indian War, colonists are not allowed to move west of the Appalachian. But they are still forced to pay taxes that were meant for defense. However, colonists continued to move west because of lack of land, because of how they're being treated, and sometimes just because they're just being plain old rebellious. They don't want people telling them where they could and could not live. This is going to cause more tension between themselves and the natives. So with more and more taxes being held, you do have a lot of people who are not seeing the benefit of those taxes. One, because of their own stupidity, moving out into hostile territory. Maybe not stupidity, because of their own desires. They have, concerns and frustrations. Excuse me while I turn off my phone. With the fact that they're not seeing any sort of defense. Property rights. Once again, Native Americans do not see property as something that can, or see land as something that can be owned. So when trading with colonists for goods, natives thought that they were coming out on top. But when the colonists started fencing off land, that put a damper on their relations. So basically what would happen is colonists would move into the frontier, and as they would go, they would meet up with Native Americans who were shrewd businessmen, and businesswomen, I guess, but most of the time we read about men. So these are shrewd business people, and as they are talking to the colonists, in their mind, they're like, these crazy fools, they can't own land. They're wanting land. Sure, here you go. You can have this land. And then the colonists start putting up fences. That's going to cause a problem. Why on earth are you putting up a fence? That doesn't jibe with Native American culture. So that is going to increase frustrations and hostilities between colonists and natives. And colonists are going to be calling out for, where's my defense? Where's my defense? And people are going to say, pay more taxes for your defense. We also have mercantilism. If you remember, mercantilism is the idea that the world's wealth is fixed. So King George has said, you know what, you guys in the colonies, you haven't had to pay that much, so it's time for you to pay up. King George III is the King of England at this time. He's not remembered as a great intellect, but as a very simple man who at times went insane, literally. And he basically one day decided, it's not this simple, but, you know, he decided that the colonies had gone for far too long without paying much in taxes for their defense and support. Therefore, he started taxing even the smallest of items. So, once again, we've already mentioned several of those. There's the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, Quartering Act. There's all these different taxes that are being imposed. And with the Stamp Act Congress, excuse me, they respond, and ultimately they're crying out, you know, no taxation without representation, and Parliament backed down. Now, if Parliament had not backed down, it is a very real possibility that they either could have started the revolution quicker or could have quelled what was taking place in the colonies, but they didn't. They backed down only to come back and start doing the same thing with taxing people without giving them the opportunity to vote or to have a say in what was going on. So after the Stamp Act Congress, the king basically wants to punish, and I'll put that in air quotes. So the king wants to punish New York for its rebellion by sending in troops and obligating the colonists to quarter them. Although the colonists were generally not against housing troops, they were incredibly angry that Parliament would again order something without so much as a by your leave. So the other colonies began to rally around New York, but its biggest supporter was Massachusetts, where we see Samuel Adams sort of leading the charge. The Boston Massacre takes place with, you can see at the bottom right-hand corner, it, you know, something that we hear and what we tend to think is that, you know, there's a bunch of colonists, they're all standing around, they're not doing anything, and then boom, British soldiers just fire into the crowd. And that's really not the case. Colonists were taunting British soldiers. They were, the British soldiers were guarding a particular building, and then somebody starts throwing snowballs. More than likely it had snowballs with rocks in them. And then, we don't know who, but somebody fires a shot. And again, we don't know who, but somebody fires a shot. And when that happens, all Hades breaks loose. So this is a snowball fight gone wrong. The soldiers fire into the crowd, and not many people died. I mean, how many is too many? I have no idea how I zoomed. Okay. But anyway, 5 colonists died, 6 others were wounded. The revolutionaries exaggerated the event to heighten civilian sympathies as well as patriotic fervor. So the British troops were tried, but not convicted of anything major, basically due to their defense by John Adams, cousin to Samuel Adams. Sam Adams continued to be more violent than John, and he used his oratorical skills, his speaking skills, to persuade the colonists to fight. So with the introduction of the Tea Act, passed in 1773, which could potentially cause a financial hardship for merchants and consumers alike, Sam Adams leads a group of people, somewhere possibly around about 7,000 colonists, the Sons of Liberty being there with them, dressed as Mohawk Indians. They board a ship that is filled with tea, and they toss the tea overboard. Thus, they begin a boycott on tea. And the king was really, really angry about this, which makes sense. And, I've had the question before, why is tea such a big deal? Well, the water in North America was nasty. It was disgusting. So because tea was boiled, it was the non-alcoholic drink of choice. It was something you could drink without really getting sick. In response to the Tea Party, as it came to be known, Boston was singled out and faced the brunt of all the penalties. Boston Harbor was closed, the Charter of Massachusetts was annulled, and the king said he was going to appoint their government. A new act required everyone to quarter troops at a fraction of the cost. British soldiers and officials accused of crimes were to be sent back to England, not to be tried in the colonies. And then the coup de grace, a new act, gave Catholics religious freedoms between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. So this is going to really, really frustrate the very Protestant colonists. We have a minister during the American Revolution, John Witherspoon, and he is quoted as saying or writing, I forget which one now, my apologies, there is not a single instance in history in which civil liberty was lost and religious liberty preserved entire. So this is when we really see everybody sort of coming together to respond to what is taking place between the colonies and the mother country. There are other ministers that begin to join the fray. Southerners suffered economically under all the new taxes, so the fact that the colonies were fighting for liberty is rather interesting, in that the southern colonies were very dependent on slavery, and then the northerners who wanted a complete break from England, they simply brushed the issue of slavery under the rug. So slavery is going to be a problem that's going to crop up again and again, and just sort of file that in the back of your mind. We have people like Thomas Paine, who makes a big splash in American revolutionary ideas. Paine provided a new and widely accepted argument for independence by advocating a complete break. Common Sense, his famous work, is oriented to the future in a way that compels the reader to make an immediate choice. It offered a solution for Americans disgusted and alarmed at the threat of tyranny. So Thomas Paine, just a very good writer. My favorite quote of his: "These are the times that try men's souls." So now we have the colony starting to gain support. We have a group of men sort of established in every colony, and in most colonies and many cities, known as Minutemen. And these were men who were supposed to be ready in a minute's notice, in case fighting were to happen. So these are the militia. We don't know exactly who fired the first shot of the American Revolution. The British were on their way to Concord when they stopped off in Lexington. And in Lexington, there was a group of militiamen who were hanging out, and a fight broke out. Only a few people died, but this is really what sort of gets the American Revolution off and going. It takes a little while, but George Washington does accept the mantle of leadership. He's really seen as a humble man who didn't think he was worthy of accepting the position, and he turns out to be the best person for the job. I might possibly argue that, maybe he didn't think that he was the best person for the job. He also could have been a person who wanted to seem to be humble. I mean, we don't really know. From his writings, it does appear that he is confident, and he's confident in the people around him, sometimes a little too much so. But you can read his speech and know for sure, or not know for sure, but when you read it, you can make a decision. In November 1775, the British issue a Freedom Proclamation. And in response to what's taking place, the British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any slaves of rebellious Americans who were able to enter British lines. So throughout the course of the war, tens of thousands of African Americans will seek their freedom by supporting the British. A much smaller number do fight on the patriot or the pro-independence side, despite policies that did discourage their enlistment. On June 17th, 1775, in the first major action of the war, inexperienced colonial soldiers held off hardened British veterans for more than 2 hours at Breed's Hill. Although eventually forced to abandon their position, including the high ground of Bunker Hill overlooking Boston, the Patriots showed that they were not intimidated by the Redcoats, which is what the British were called more often than not. Of the 2,200 British that saw action, more than 1,000 ended up dead or wounded. We see the adoption of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. By issuing the Declaration of Independence, the 13 American colonies severed their political connections to Great Britain. The Declaration summarized the colonists' motivations for seeking their independence. By declaring themselves an independent nation, the American colonists were going to be able to conclude an official alliance with the government of France, as well as to obtain French assistance in the war against Great Britain. A lot of people did not want to break with Great Britain over this. They wanted certain things to be recognized, and when that didn't happen, there was a push to completely break from the mother country. Britain had several issues when fighting the American Revolution. You can see them listed here. They're not on their home turf. They're in hostile territory. They had a great navy. They were the naval power of the world. But having a great navy is not going to help you when you're fighting on land. Just not very much. They also didn't have a set strategic center from which to deploy troops. Frontier battles were completely foreign to them. Guerrilla warfare and whatnot, it's not what they were accustomed to. Native Americans decided to stay neutral for the most part. You do see some fighting on one side or the other, but for the most part, they just kind of stay out of it. You know, there was the hope maybe that they would just kill each other off and they'd have their land again. I don't know. That's how I imagine it. That's Miss Walker's interpretation. The commanders of the British Army are operating independently and very far away from each other, and that's difficult. Communication lines can be cut very quickly. Then we have France. France, Vive la France, comes in towards the end and gives the Americans a boost. In December of 1777, the British were occupying Philadelphia, just 20 miles away from the Continental Army, who entered their winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. During the winter, supply arrangements were improved, and Continental troops were drilled, and they emerged as a more disciplined, unified fighting force. Now, the authors of your book say that it really is due in large part to Washington's leadership. He definitely proved himself to be a very capable leader, and even through extreme hunger, extreme cold, privation, he was able to rally his forces against the British. In February of 1778, we have the French. They wanted to make sure that the Americans could actually win. So still suffering from a war debt, or from war debts, as a result of the 7 Years' War, among other things. With the Patriot victory at Saratoga, as well as American diplomatic efforts, France finally decides that they can ally themselves with the new American government. French financial and military aid proved critical in winning the war. And the Continental Army did not learn of their French alliance until May, so it took them a little bit of time. So we've moved very quickly through the Revolution, but this is because we've just got a lot of material to cover. But we get into the final battles in the 1780s. May 12th, 1780, the British took Charleston, South Carolina, and they captured a large Patriot army and deal the rebels one of their worst defeats of the war. The Charleston move is a part of a broader British strategy to hang on to the southern colonies, at least now that the war was stalemated in Pennsylvania and New York. January 17th, 1781, Continental soldiers and Patriot militia under General Daniel Morgan defeated a British force from Tarleton at Cowpens. Coming on the heels of the victory at Kings Mountain, Cowpens helped to convince worried patriots that the British Southern strategy could be countered. Tarleton's soldiers did not have a good meal in several days. Then he marched them at 3 a.m. in order to get to Morgan's forces. Now, Tarleton was sort of, he was just very, very mean. Let's say it's easy. I'm very tired. I cannot think of better words here. Tarleton was known for not quartering troops. Basically, he would kill any POW or any prisoner of war. So Tarleton normally wins, and he's incredibly cocky. So he's marching his soldiers in order to meet up with Morgan's forces and to cut them down to size. But Morgan is smart. Morgan, he's trapped his troops in between a flooded river and the enemy. And he does this for two reasons. One is to keep his forces from running away. And two, because he knew how Tarleton would attack. Tarleton would only attack from the front. So, in a surprising turn of events, the Patriots have a great victory over Tarleton, and it proves to be a huge psychological boost for the Continental Army. From September to October 1781, there's a joint French and American force which traps a large British army on Virginia's Yorktown Peninsula. Unable to evacuate or receive reinforcements because a French fleet drove off the British fleet, General Cornwallis was forced to surrender. Although New York City and Charleston, South Carolina remained in British hands until a peace treaty was signed 2 years later, basically the war for American independence was over. So just to sort of conclude all of this, actually, let's not go to that slide. Let's look at the top there, at the painting in the top right corner. This illustration is a copy of a sketch which shows the American negotiators at the Peace of Paris. The sketch remains incomplete because British negotiators chose not to sit for their half of the portrait, which I think is hilarious. And it has served as a powerful symbol of the division between Great Britain and its former American colonies. And I totally forgot to mention the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. My apologies. With the Treaty of Paris, independence is definitely secure, but Canada does remain in British hands. 1784, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix imposed a peace on those members of the Iroquois Confederacy that sided with the British in the Revolution. The war's aftermath proved devastating to the Native Americans because with no European allies to rely on, Indian tribes would be under increasing pressure from settlers moving west out of the original 13 states. So the American Revolution, for some, a great victory, for others, an irritation, and for still others, it is more than defeat. It is a complete change in their way of life. So this is what I would like for you to do for Wednesday. Well, yeah, let's make it Wednesday. I have, I'm sorry, I'm getting this wrong. Not for Wednesday, for the following Monday. This is your assignment for the following Monday. I want you to read that excerpt from Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Use that whole excerpt, and I want you to complete the following in essay form. 1. Discuss Paine's meaning behind the phrase, "The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind." Secondly, why did Paine argue that the Revolution was a universal circumstance and not a local one? So let's go back over. For Friday, you need to read, or for coming up on this Friday, you need to read Letters from a Loyalist Wife. I want you to answer the questions and upload that no later than noon on Friday under the coursework tab. This essay should be submitted by Monday. Under the coursework tab, no later than 9 p.m. If you have any questions, please email me, and I will see you, as the Lord wills, on Wednesday. Thanks for your attention.